Now, despite lengthy negotiations, it appears the war Russia launched against Ukraine is no closer to ending. Russian and American aides reported that 5 hours of conversations in Moscow earlier this week produced progress. But during a visit to India, President Putin threatened to liberate the Donbass by military or other means, that is, eastern Ukraine. A Ukrainian delegation heads to Florida to meet with US officials in a bid for a ceasefire and a fair deal. Joshua Yaffa, a contributing writer for The New Yorker, has reported on the war since 2022, and he joins Michelle Martin to discuss what it would take to stop it.
Thanks, Christian. Joshua Yaffa, thank you so much for talking with us once again.
Thanks for having me.
You know, we talked at the beginning of this conflict, the beginning of this kind of Russia's all-out invasion of Ukraine. Are you surprised we're having the same conversation 4 years later?
Hard to think back to those early days of the war when I was in Kiev and we spoke. I think I was actually in a subway station overnight, sheltering with other residents of the city, where actually many residents of Kiev still go these nights to shelter from Russian air attacks. So there is a kind of sad, tragic Groundhog Day nature to the conflict and how it feels, certainly for the people in Ukraine. Really, the dynamics of the war, why the war started and how the war might end, have stayed remarkably constant, which essentially is Russia, Vladimir Putin, seek to severely limit, if not negate, Ukrainian sovereignty, to limit both politically, certainly militarily, the kind of potential Ukraine has to chart its own course, especially if that means growing closer with the West, either politically, above all, militarily through NATO. So that's something that Putin seeks to not just limit, but essentially take off the table for generations to come. It's a kind of historical project for him. Yeah. And Ukraine looks to preserve that sovereignty, right? Looks to preserve its sovereign right to chart its own historical path, culturally, politically, militarily, right? The military aspect actually is seen as a way of protecting those other realms. And so what Putin seeks to achieve, his kind of ultimate strategic war aims, are exactly what Ukraine considers anathema and sort of non-starters, something it can't agree to, as it understands, for the kind of survival of the nation. And so we're at loggerheads, right? We're at a war that grinds on, each side thinking that a bit more time can improve its position, mainly because it will exhaust its opponent. And that's really the kind of the grinding logic of the war of attrition we're still stuck in 4 years later.
So one of the reasons we're speaking now is that we're in the midst of kind of a flurry of diplomatic moves. The President Trump's envoys, Steve Witkoff, a former golf buddy of his, a fellow real estate developer, and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, they just concluded this, sort of hours-long session. NATO is meeting without the United States, interestingly enough, and the Ukrainian president has been kind of back and forth to Europe, trying to shore up support there. This comes after this lengthy sort of peace proposal was put on the table, ostensibly crafted by the United States, but it's emerged that it was very much initially based on Russia's sort of talking points. So the first thing I wanted to ask you is, does this flurry of diplomacy mean anything to your knowledge in the context of what we've seen so far? Does it seem like it is any kind of an inflection point, or is it just another day?
There are some new dynamics, right? Despite what we talked about a minute ago, and that the kind of overall, the logic of the war has remained constant. Of course, there are dynamics that come up. The most important one is Donald Trump as president of the United States, who has a dramatically different position regarding Russia. And I don't think we need to sort of go over, right, his history of conciliatory statements toward Putin. But I think ultimately what's most important is Trump's desire to end the war. If President Biden had a desire to end the war in a way that, as he and European partners understood it, would deliver some kind of both durable and just peace for Ukraine, Trump is interested in ending the war, getting a victory, a diplomatic victory, his Nobel Peace Prize, like, for example, was the case with the Gaza deal from last fall, where how the war ended was less important than the fact that it did end. And so then it flows from that it's only natural, if you're interested in speed, that you effectively put pressure on the weaker party, and that is Ukraine, right? And Ukraine is the weaker party for a number of reasons. Certainly just by looking at the battlefield dynamics, Russian army just objectively, quantitatively, much larger. It's moving forward, and Ukraine is losing territory. At the same time, Ukraine is under increasing financial pressure. The Ukraine budget could really be running out of cash effectively. And the third point is a political crisis stemming from a corruption scandal in Ukraine that hits really close to Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine's president. People around him, his longtime chief of staff, right-hand man, Andrei Yermak, was forced to resign this week under the specter of a corruption allegation. So all of that comes together to put Ukraine in a much more difficult and vulnerable position. And it's that position that Russia hopes the Trump administration will effectively exploit, right? That the Trump administration will be so interested in a peace deal fast and kind of really twist Ukraine's arm. Putin thinks that time will bring him closer to victory. So as far as Putin sees it, either he gets the deal he wants or he doesn't and keeps fighting, and that will still get him closer to the deal he wants eventually.
So what does Putin want? This is one of the things that was interesting about this 28-point peace plan that was evidently, at least based on a kind of a transcript of a leaked phone call that was reported by Bloomberg, where the president's envoy, Steve Witkoff, was overheard speaking to his Russian counterpart and coaching him on how to win over President Trump. But one of the things that was interesting about this document is it really kind of laid out Russian objectives in black and white. What are they?
Well, first, I would caution a little bit of seeing the 28-point Witkoff plan as a kind of pure expression of Russian or Putin priorities. Certainly, there was Russian input. We know now about the genesis of that document. But my sources in Moscow, foreign policy circles, I wrote about this in the New Yorker last week, were actually cautious about that Witkoff document. These are kind of potentially some kind of attractive for Russia sounding proposals, but how are they implemented? How can Russia count on them? Politicians come and go. Even Trump, as one Moscow source told me, right, is a temporary political phenomenon, right? He could be out of office in 3 years, and just like U.S. policy shifted so dramatically from Biden to Trump, it could shift again. Now to the sort of core question, right? Mm-hmm. What Putin wants, and he's actually spoken about this quite openly, right? And what he thinks is that Ukraine has essentially become, he calls it, a quote, anti-Russian project, right? It's been led astray by the West, that its integration with Western political and certainly military structures like NATO, right, is the kind of ahistorical aberration. That's not Ukraine's place, and it's being kind of led out of Russia's rightful sphere of influence, and Russia simply cannot tolerate this, quote, anti-Russian project on Russian borders, that the idea that there would be foreign military bases, foreign troops stationed in Ukraine, with a Ukraine that is culturally and historically rejecting Russia, all of that feels like a kind of security threat as Putin sees it, that is simply a kind of a non-starter for Russia, a non-starter for his own political legacy that he's trying to ensure. This is right. We're also dealing with an autocrat who's been in power for 26 years and counting. And I think that also kind of affects how he sees the world and his own place in Russian history. What this is not about is territory. It's not about lines on a map. It's not about, where are the borders drawn, who controls what city. All of those issues are proxies for Putin's real issue, which is that Ukraine simply cannot be allowed to be a threat as he defines it.
And why is the cost worth it to him? I mean, we've been reporting at NPR, we've reported that he's losing as many as 25,000 soldiers a month. What makes it worth that cost in lives?
What's important to remember is that Putin's initial calculation in launching this invasion was that the war would be quick, the Ukrainian army would crumble, he'd be in Kyiv in 3 days, right? So we have to understand that Putin has ended up in a protracted war that he never counted on, and either would have made different calculations or not launched the invasion if he knew. Who knows? Those are all in the realm of kind of hypotheticals. But he counted on something very different. What he's ended up in is a war of attrition. And the kind of grim, dark logic of a war of attrition is you win by having your opponent lose more. So everything you just said about loss of troops, cost to the economy, it's relative to how those factors are weighing on Ukraine, right? And Ukraine is a smaller country economically, population, and there are large questions about Ukraine's ability to continue to field trained, equipped infantry, right? There's a huge problem with troops going AWOL or deserting in Ukraine, right? So the kind of the manpower question is very real in the Ukrainian army. And the financial question, according to some prognoses, Ukraine could be in serious financial deficit, really running out of cash to run the country by the first quarter of next year. Europe, as Ukraine's chief financial backer, they can't seem to get a plan together. They can't seem to get this money to Ukraine. So getting back to your question, this war is incredibly, incredibly costly for Putin. He would like for it to end, but his calculation is that he can achieve his strategic objectives with time because things are actually worse for Ukraine. And it is Ukraine who will be forced to effectively bend the knee faster than Russia will run out of, whether it's troops to fuel the war, money to fuel the war, and so on.
Let's talk about the European position. I mean, one of the arguments from the sort of the European side is that if Russia is rewarded or is successful in invading Ukraine, who's next? Could it be Poland? Could it be Moldova? Who's next? And so the question is, why isn't there more urgency in Europe around supporting Ukraine, at least giving them the resources to resist?
That's a great question. One I ask often as a reporter myself who lives in Europe. I'm based in Berlin. I'm talking to you tonight from Warsaw. And of course, the view in Warsaw is very different than the view, let's say, in Budapest, Hungary, right, where Viktor Orban just recently went to Moscow to meet with Putin, or in a place like Portugal, Greece, right? Frontline states, as they're called, like Poland, have, of course, different view of this than states elsewhere in Europe. And that's part of the problem, right, is kind of how do you triangulate positions among these states that have different sense of urgency, different sense of priority. Some are trying to deal with their own domestic situations. There's little appetite in European populations for taking out, for going further into deficit, right, for taking out new loans, to essentially having new European taxpayers foot the bill for increased aid to Ukraine. But your point or your question really is absolutely the correct one, and I don't have an answer to it, right? The Europeans were so upset about the emergence of these 28 points and how it was done by a kind of end run around European states, European diplomats, didn't take into account European interests. Well, where is the European peace plan, right? I mean, if in a vacuum will be filled, perhaps in ways that you don't like, right? But I didn't see European diplomats out in front of a EU-led peace plan. There was an attempt to create one after Witkoff and the 28 points emerged, but that plan was quickly discarded effectively both by Russia and Trump. And it seems like Europe hasn't attempted since. And the point about the money, I think, gets to the real crux of the matter, which is European politicians say all the right things about the importance of supporting Ukraine, the strategic interest of making sure Ukraine doesn't lose this war, that Russian aggression cannot be rewarded. But where kind of does the rubber hit the road? You
mentioned earlier that we don't need to go through the litany of conciliatory and even laudatory statements that President Trump has made about Vladimir Putin over the years. But have we ever figured out why President Trump seems so disposed toward the Russian position and Vladimir Putin in particular?
I've never been a fan, going back to 2016, 17, of the more kind of conspiratorial versions of this, right? I don't think there's any Russian compromat on Trump. I don't think he's afraid of, some tape that may have been made in the Ritz-Carlton many years ago that was, discussed almost a decade ago or so. Now, I think the answer is rather simple. One is that Putin is a legible, understandable kind of leader for Trump, right? That it's easier to deal with Putin, strongman, unitary power in his country. Also just the kind of man and the kind of leader that Trump, again, understands, admires, knows how to do business with. And in the current context, I mentioned this earlier, what Trump really wants is to be seen as the peacemaker in Ukraine. He just wants the war to be over. He wants to be able to go on Truth Social and say, I did it. I created peace in Ukraine. He wants his Nobel Prize. He wants, this aura like he got in Gaza of having ended the war. But if we remember in Gaza, right, it's a kind of peace plan with all of these other points to be negotiated later. Is that happening? I'm no expert on the Middle East. I don't want to speak to that. But, I think what Trump would like is something similar, which is the headline of peace. And the particulars of it can be dealt with later or maybe not at all.
You've been in and out of Ukraine over the course of these years, and you've talked to people there all the time. Clearly, they're war weary. But do you have a sense of how they view the current situation? You just pointed out that there's just been just body blow after body blow, some of them sort of self-inflicted, like this corruption scandal that you just mentioned. What is your sense of morale?
Right. War weary, I think, is exactly the right way to put it. I mean, Kiev right now, which at various points in the war had been more or less relatively spared, at least a kind of semblance of normal life continued, and still does continue actually during the day. But, you know, regular drone attacks at night, but more importantly for daily life, you know, long stretches of blackout, hours at a time, 10 hours or so or more of rolling blackouts across the capital city of Ukraine. So of course that sort of brings the war home and leads to a new sense of exhaustion that even in the capital city, life is so impacted. You know, you ask however many million, tens of millions of Ukrainians about how the war should end, you'll get as many millions of responses. But generally, I think there really is a willingness to end the war, knowing that it's not going to end with a kind of resounding Russian defeat, that Ukraine gets all its territory back and joins NATO. Ukrainians understand that there's going to be an ugly deal to end this war. It's going to be ugly and it's going to be unfair for Ukraine, that the aggressor in some way will be rewarded. I think we're just objectively on that trajectory. What Ukrainians want above all is that a sense that for the sacrifices, certainly for the lives lost, both huge losses in the military, incredible losses that you, myself, other colleagues have documented among civilians, at least Ukraine gains. They're often talked about as security guarantees. What it really means is the confident hope that this will not happen again in 1 year, 2 year, 5 years, that there is a durable peace. And that means a Ukraine that is secure and sovereign over the medium and long term.
Before we let you go, what are you going to be keeping your eyes on over these next months?
Well, so Ukraine, to put it simply, in my estimation, is ready for compromise, real concessions, not capitulation, right? I think that's the key distinction. But Ukraine is really ready to make some painful concessions to end this war. Putin, on the other hand, is still insisting on his kind of maximalist goals. The question is, do those shift at all, right? Does Putin continue to insist on it's all or nothing for me, and I think that victory is just around the corner, so I'm going to keep on pressing? Does anything in his calculation change, right? Does he actually soften those maximalist goals? Does he understand that, okay, I'll take, 7 out of 10 of those points, or perhaps he thinks, I'm actually not getting anywhere in advancing them, so I better cut a deal. Right now, there's no indication of either of those dynamics happening. But again, since Ukraine is willing to make a peace, willing to make a painful peace, actually, it's really the ball, so to speak, is in Putin's court, right? Does anything change in his calculus, either because of what's happening on the battlefield or the policies of Western states? For right now, the answer is no. But wars change in dynamic, unpredictable ways, and it's possible that the next weeks and months brings a different trajectory. Although, again, keeping in the sad theme of this conversation, I'm rather pessimistic. I wouldn't expect that, right? But that's something certainly to keep an eye on that could affect the dynamic.
Joshua Yaffa, thank you so much for talking with us once again.
Thanks for having me.